Health. The story about health is, maybe I start with a question. When you hear the word health, what are you thinking of? I would say that is the number one difference when you speak with a Chinese about health and when you speak with a European or American about health. I think a lot of Chinese equate health and safety. Meaning I go and eat in a McDonald's. I take the most extreme example, and I'm not saying you will agree with that, but you will actually find actually Chinese agreeing with that. McDonald's has been doing, and KFC has been doing very well in China, despite the trends towards health. And part of the reason is that even Western fast food chains are perceived to be healthy because they're safe, because the food I eat there is clean. We ask people about Element Fresh that you may know, and ask why is Element Fresh basically healthy? And people said, well, the way how the food is prepared, the dishes it's in, is very clean, it's very safe. I basically know that the ingredients are good. From the eyes of a German, that has not a lot to do with health, because if I think about health, I think about portion control, nutrition, I think many of the other points we were saying. Calories as well. I think there's a lot of equation from a European's perspective that calories and health don't go well together. If you talk about China, actually calorie intake is not declining at all. Calorie intake is skyrocketing. That means people basically think about health, but you still don't see any low-calorie beer, no calorie beer, no Diet Coke, none of that. It's just, it's tiny, it's marginal. In most of the rest of the world, like the diet product, the Diet Cokes are reaching half of the soda consumption. In China, it's a rounding error. And that, although I'm going to speak here about basically how healthy basically the Chinese are turning, and maybe I skip those charts. I think there's a lot around perception and how the Chinese perception basically is different around health. There's a lot about cold and warm, basically traditional Chinese medicine, and a lot of that is basically affiliated with the concept of health. One example, I mentioned the soda example and the portion control. Ambient yogurt came up. And ambient yogurt is a good example. I think ambient yogurt, for those who don't know, it's a yogurt basically which is made differently, so you don't need to put it in the fridge. And that is a category of yogurt which has been growing very, very well. It's been extremely successful, has been gaining a big share of the market. Part of the reason is because if you don't need to put it in the fridge, it's already basically safer than something which you put in the fridge. Because if you put it in the fridge and the cold chain doesn't really work well, then the product may actually not be good. So an ambient yogurt from that respect is perceived to be safer. At the same time, an ambient yogurt by no means is healthier. Because if you talk about what an ambient yogurt has, there's no probiotics in it. It's basically a lot of sugar. So in that respect, you talk about a product which is perceived healthier, but in reality is actually not healthier. Same thing with fresh milk. And I need to say, guilty as charged, Germans also believe that fresh milk is actually better than UHT, which is not the case. There's no scientific evidence that UHT milk is less healthy than fresh milk. But you do have a phenomenon that there's a perception created around that. Where does it lead to? We do see a lot of gyms, we read a lot of running and exercise activities. Marathons, I think it's a huge buzz, right? More than 300 marathons we've seen this year in China. It's a great thing to post that on the channels, run 100 kilometers in 30 days. A lot around that. At the same time, given then the portion intake, oh sorry, I wanted to say something about smoking. You would also expect that smoking goes down, but smoking is also not decreasing substantially. So I think the element that smoking is something bad is also not has fully reached the country. I mean, the Chinese tobacco company, government owned, is something like 80 or 90% of the global tobacco sticks. And obviously it's a big country, right? But 80, 90% is still a lot of smoking happening in this country, and that is not significantly changing. So I think it hasn't reached that part of. And as a result of that, you actually do see, when you look at obesity rates among the adults, China is extremely low. But if you look at the young generation, The obesity rate is already higher than some of the other mature markets.
Do you see this also with smoking then, across generations?
To be honest, I don't know how this. My hunch would be that the old generation smokes more than the young generation, but I'm not sure of that. But I don't have the numbers to support that. Where I do have the numbers to support it is, and that I found very interesting, when I speak with my colleagues about drinking habits, like Baiju. Everybody tells me Baiju is the old generation, it's government officials, it's my parents. It's totally wrong. It's totally wrong. It has to do with speaking with a certain number of people, right? McKinsey colleagues is a certain segment of the market, but not representative. If you look at the whole country, Baiju consumption among the young generation is actually fairly high, which very few people basically realize, know, or accept. But there is an enormous amount of Baiju consumption. And at the same time, all the Western spirit, which basically I think many of us in this group will be familiar with. I always joke and saying all of China drinks as much vodka as like one nightclub in New York. And that's not a fact, but it's not totally off from reality. So just the dimension of Western spirits in China is really, really tiny. With a bit of an exception of cognac, which is quite big. But if you take cognac out, the rest is very, very, very small. Whereas Baiju, even a young generation, is still very strong. And there's a plan in place. Healthy China 2030 plan to basically make sure that the obesity numbers actually don't turn into the adult generation. And that actually will have an impact. And as I shared earlier with those trends, right, we have the gyms coming, or the gyms already came up. If you think about what have been the most successful consumer categories over the last 2 years, sports is absolutely basically outperforming anything else. I'm talking about sneakers and t-shirt, a lot of logo tees as well. So the sports apparel companies actually have an amazing, basically 2017, 16, actually an amazing last 10 years, but the last 2 years have been particularly good. So I think you're seeing that clearly translating here. Also Decathlon, the French sports apparel brand, I think opened another 60 stores this year, 50 stores this year. Big stores, a couple of thousand square meters space. So we see that on part of it basically translating into consumption.